So Kate, thank you ever so much for making time today. Great to see you. Just start by just saying a few words about yourself, please, just for people who don't already know you.
Sure. So I'm Kate Cheema. I have a background, let me see, so I describe myself as a career analyst. I joined the NHS in a performance management analyst type role. My first job was doing delayed transfers of care in the community in Southampton. And that was around 2003. So spent a lot of time in the NHS, but about a year ago, I took the plunge and left the health service and moved over to the British Heart Foundation as their Director of Health Intelligence to help develop their health intelligence function. And over the course of that time, have spent time in acute trusts, primary care, CSUs, you name it. So quite a broad background, I guess. But yeah, basically still a jobbing analyst.
I was going to say a broad range of different perspectives, and yet the same analytical core.
Absolutely.
So I'm going to ask you to draw on those different perspectives as we go through them, and maybe do that with the first question. It's incredibly broad. Just tell me a bit about the value of analysis as you see it in health and social care.
I think we are in an evidence-based industry, right? We don't, no one treats a disease without effective evidence underpinning it, and yet we so often see decisions being made without that evidence base, and it's just really as simple as that. Good analysis develops that evidence base and enables you to say something in an objective way rather than relying on that subjective gut. Not that sometimes that subjective gut isn't valuable, but it's never going to be valuable in its own right. And then kind of building on that a little bit, I think for me personally, and this applies in the charity sector as much as it does in the health service, it helps you create that virtuous cycle of quality improvement, of making things better. If you have made your initial decision to improve a service, or in my new world, if you like, take a policy decision or anything like that, if you've based that on solid evidence and solid analysis, you're going to be in a much better position to understand whether or not you've actually made the change that you want to see. So it's so blindingly obvious to me that it's the bedrock of every decision that we should be making across every facet of our work.
It's blindingly obvious, but it's not so obvious that you can't still see it. It's kind of there, isn't it? You've got, yeah. So you're thinking about it in terms of decision making and helping people to make more optimal decisions. I also really like the comparison you seem to be drawing between the decisions that we require people to make in health and social care, having a good, strong evidence base in terms of things like treatment, contrasted perhaps with some of the decisions that we might see or we might make in the sort of managerial or the policy territory as well. Have you got any further thoughts on maybe the distinction between those two things? It seems to be the managerial world a bit more political, a bit less certain.
Yeah, I think that there are. I think that perhaps it kind of boils back down to how we do our training, if you like. It's baked into medical and nursing training, this concept of the scientific method, which is effectively what we're talking about, which doesn't always make it into that training on the job that often happens in the managerial space, and the discipline that needs to come with that. It's a baked in assumption. Certainly my medical colleagues who I deal with now, that's their starting point, whereas with policy we often find ourselves working backwards from this is the end point we want to reach, how can we evidence the journey there, which isn't perhaps quite the right way round. So I think it's as much a cultural difference as it is it's certainly not for want of accessibility to an evidence base or analytical skill and or data in its kind of raw form. I'm still quite new in the policy space, so I'm finding lots of different approaches. I feel that it's a much more nebulous area to be in, and kind of difficult sometimes to put your arms around exactly what you're trying to achieve with a particular kind of policy development or piece of work. And on that basis, it becomes the analytical questions that you might need to answer are far less clear cut. And that's where I think analysts really add the value, because we can help frame those questions at the beginning rather than kind of just give me all the data you've got kind of conversations that I'm sure probably resonate with a few people watching this now. And we can start to bring some shape and some discipline to perhaps an area, policy areas that aren't always easy to manage conceptually.
That's a fascinating reflection. And some of the colleagues I'm lucky enough to work with are brilliant analysts, and you see them involved in certain situations, at the early stage of problem formulation or something, and people will come away from the meeting or whatever it was going, oh, thank you, they're such a good analyst. And they'll say, I've not done that. I've done no analysis. I've just helped you structure the problem. It's a way of thinking.
Absolutely. And I think often some of our customers, for want of a better term, don't always understand the value that can be brought in bringing analytical expertise, and it's a particular way of thinking and breaking down a problem into the room in those very early discussions. It's as part of a multidisciplinary team to develop the question, develop the process as well. And certainly throughout my career, the most successful, exciting, and the projects, if anyone asks me what are your kind of top 3 most proud of projects, all of them have had me or my colleagues involved from the very beginning, and we've been a part of it from end to end, rather than, oh, can we evidence that we've made a difference now, please, kind of right at the end. That continues. That's a key theme throughout every element of every aspect of the health service I've ever worked in, and certainly it continues to be a theme in the charity sector now.
That's great. It resonates very strongly with me too. So you've started to talk about it, and so I'll ask you outright. We've talked about the value that analysis can have. We've talked about the value of the analytical mindset, I suppose, or the way of approaching problems. But what's your assessment of the way in which, or how well health and social care systems and decision makers currently use analysis?
I think it's incredibly variable, and to some extent often. And again, this is just my own reflections, rest upon the understanding of what analysis is. And I think in areas where it's viewed as a technical discipline, we find that the use of that is perhaps not always as good as it could be. But where it's viewed as more of a creative discipline, albeit through a technical medium, I think that tends to give rise to a culture where analysis and analysts as a body, as a workforce, are more valued. I try and think of it sometimes in terms of storytelling. So rather than technicians putting the kind of bricks together, if we can be viewed as helping to tell the story as storytellers, and thinking about it as a creative in that kind of creative space. In my experience, that's where it's been used best. So, a lot of that I think comes down to individuals and the leadership that's there, and the conversations that analytical leaders have with their opposite numbers in managerial or medical or whatever context they're in, and being able to demonstrate but also articulate that analysis is not just about the numbers, it's about the story that's around it and the creativity that comes with developing that.
That's fascinating. One thing that's occurred to me throughout all of these interviews, and maybe it's occurred too late, maybe I should have known this up front, that this space for the analytical leader seems to be being described. I mean, the way you were putting it there, there's a role for creativity, for influencing decision making, for hopefully infusing others with a certain type of mindset. So all of this sort of space seems to be emerging through these different conversations that I've had with people. The other thing I've realised is I'm talking to analytical leaders. maybe you are. So maybe this is too close to home. But could you reflect for me a little bit on that role, on the role of the analyst as leader? What does analytical leadership mean?
That's a really good question, and I think, to be really honest, I think it's something that I'm still working out myself, because it changes so much. We're living in a really fast-changing and fast-paced working world, especially at the moment. So I think if you'd asked me 8 weeks ago what I thought an analytical leader is, it would probably give you a different answer to what I might give you now. I think that the critical element for an analytical leader is that translational piece, and supporting colleagues, not obviously at a leadership level, but actually throughout the whole of the workforce, and analytical colleagues as well, to really appreciate and articulate the value that analysts and put my teeth back in, analysts and analysis can bring, and kind of at the beginning of the process, if you like, but then at the end, when we have that product, I think analytical leadership, and this is something that isn't just baked into people with director job titles, it's an element of leadership that needs to pervade right the way through all of the analytical workforce, is being able to then translate that into something that is meaningful for the people who are ultimately going to be making decisions on it, or reflecting on whatever the analysis that we're providing. I think that translational element is a leadership quality, and it's a leadership quality that needs to be across the piece, not just in the kind of specific roles. So I've started that in a very specific way and then broadened it out. Leadership is everybody's business in the world of the analyst, I think. And then I also think that just the analyst leader role also has a role to kind of get out there and be seen and stand up for. I mean, we're talking about an analyst revolution. That needs someone who's out there waving the flag, and I think that there's a real role. We've got some great role models. I know you've already spoken to some amazing role models of people who are getting out there and saying, this is what this community can do for you, this is how we add value, and continuing that and really developing the support for other people to step up and do that is a really important element.
No, look, Kate, that's a fantastic articulation of that role and of that agenda. As well as the analytical leadership role, it's obviously then important that we're also deploying our analysts and our analyst workforce well too. So again, I'm after your assessment really, to what extent and in what ways do you think health and social care systems make best use of their analyst workforce that they have currently available?
So I think there are 2 points. I mean, there's so many ways to answer that question. The 2 points that really stand out for me is, firstly, bring your analysts in situ, and so that they can really be almost smothered in the context. Maybe smothered isn't quite the right term, but be close to the business, be close to the nature of what we're actually trying to do here, whether that's a quality improvement piece of work at the front line, or a business case development, whatever, it doesn't matter. If you're close to the subject and in situ, you'll be an analyst, and the analytical way of thinking will be much better, will deliver much better value, because it'll be closer to the problem and be able to structure analytical questions around it in a much more meaningful way. I think, so reflecting on a lot of my NHS career, not all of it, but a lot of it, I was a kind of jack of all trades. So I knew a lot about the data, but not always an awful lot about the context in which I had to work really hard to really understand the context that I was working in, and how I could then translate and manipulate that data to support answering a pertinent question, rather than just throwing the data kitchen sink at it. And I can kind of compare and contrast that to moving into a very specific area of kind of heart and circulatory disease at the BHF, and needing to be, I've kind of almost flipped to the opposite end, where there's an expectation that I'm absolutely on it in terms of, what is the latest research on, I don't know, the relationship between socioeconomic status and high diastolic blood pressure. For example, my team is expected to be right the way across all of that in order for us to support deliver high quality health intelligence product to support policy decisions or monitoring, particular programs of work, for example. So that was my first point, really. It's kind of that in situ and being close to the business rather than in a kind of isolated tower of data over here. And then the other piece, and I think if I had to choose between the two, this would be the one that I would pick as my number one, is encourage your analysts to be curious. Don't fence them in. I think we're often, again, reflecting in both, actually across all of my career, I've been given parameters, and so right, that's what we want to know. Here's the parameters. Well, actually, there's something really interesting over here that I've spotted. I want to pursue that, but I don't have the time, or I'm not given the resource to do that. Whereas, again, through my experience, that curiosity can give rise to some really critical findings that perhaps you weren't expecting, weren't part of the original hypothesis. So the system kind of not baking in necessarily, but certainly giving the appropriate kind of structural support, if you like, be that in terms of resources or in terms of time, to enable analytical leaders and team managers to encourage curious behaviours in analysts is a really, really critical part in terms of how we can use analysts better. That's a lovely strapline, encouraging curious behaviour in analysts. That's what we're about. Well, it's asking the question, I wonder, and I'm sure everybody who will eventually watch this has sat in front of their, I don't know, their R script or their spreadsheet or whatever and gone, I wonder what that means, and hasn't had the time to actually go and find out.
I want to ask you specifically then, I mean, given it's occurred to me for a while really that patient charities have got an incredibly valuable role in stimulating some of that curiosity, because in a sense you have a bit more flexibility, you have a topic, you have maybe more known data sets than the NHS in the round, I suppose. What do you see as the role of patient charities in all of that then, in influencing the analytical agenda?
Again, really good question, and I don't have all the answers to it yet. I'm still finding some of that out myself. I think the really big one is that we often have charities such as BHF and other patient charities have an access and an ongoing dialogue with patients or people affected by, in our case, heart and circulatory disease. That gives rise to an enormous wealth of qualitative and kind of pseudo-quantitative, but largely qualitative information that, I mean, leaving aside for one side, but for one moment, whether we ourselves use that effectively or not, but can give rise to some really, really interesting. What are the things that are really worrying people at the moment? We talk a lot about patient involvement and patient engagement, particularly in the PHM agenda. And having individuals in a room can be really useful. But if we're thinking about real engagement en masse, I think that charities like the BHF have an awful lot to offer. And then I think the other way in which we could potentially kind of support and stimulate some of these questions is to look at some of the things that we lobby for example, and try and influence. The example that springs to mind immediately is some of the work that we've done recently on air pollution and the link between that and heart and circulatory disease. Although arguably at the moment that seems to be getting a bit better given our air quality improvements. But thinking about that, we don't hold a lot of the information that NHS and that once upon a time I would have taken for granted to go and play with. I don't have direct access to any longer, and quite rightly so. So working with colleagues in particular areas or across the country, it would be amazing to be able to take some of the things that we know from our research, for example, kind of bench research, can be an issue for a particular patient group, and try and understand what that looks like at scale. So I think there's huge opportunity for collaborative working between patient charities, both in terms of data exchange, but also really getting into and understanding the impact of particular issues that are being raised through the charitable side of things.
Okay, that's fantastic. One of the things you've touched on there that has that we've certainly observed during the response to COVID has been an increase in networking and sharing and collaboration amongst the analytical community. It's been really edifying to see, and long may that kind of thing continue, exactly along the lines that you were just describing there. Kate, that's been wonderful. I've really enjoyed talking to you. Thank you ever so much for your thoughts, and I look forward to seeing you at the Analyst Revolution on the barricade.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. Viva Revolution.